Hello, my name is Malcom Morrison. I am a research scientist with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in Ottawa. And today I'm going to talk to you about heat and moisture stress in canola. It's something that I've spent a large part of my career on. This is a joint seminar to you from myself and Nate Ort. Nate was a graduate student of mine at University of Manitoba. I shared his supervision with Yvonne Lawley. And then Nate worked for the Canola Council, and now Nate is going to start his PhD at University of Saskatchewan sometime next year. So temperature and moisture stress and their effects on yield really depend on when they occur during the life cycle of canola. For example, cold stress or heat stress during emergence can kill seedlings. Heat greater than 29.5 degrees C during flowering, bolting, reduces seed yield. Frost can kill the developing embryos and reduce yield. While season-long moisture stress is rare, it's devastating, as we've seen from this past season. Periodic moisture stress, which is a duration of 2 weeks or more without significant moisture, depending upon when it occurs, can really reduce your yields. During seed development, for example, periodic moisture stress can reduce seed size and seed yield. Nate wanted to see how well farmers have done improving canola yield. And it turns out farmers have done a great job at improving canola yield. 4.1% increase per year since 2000. That's amazing. He looked at all of the years and he said, these are the normal years, these black years here, and here's above normal yield, the green dots, and this is below normal. So when we have a situation like this, we can go in and say, well, what caused the above normal yields and what caused the below normal yields? So looking at precipitation trends across the prairies from that same duration, we can see that spring has been wetter than usual. So we've seen an increase in spring precipitation, primarily in May. And this has resulted in an increase in total precipitation during the growing season. How has that influenced yield? Well, high yields occur when moisture is high. And this is represented by the green line here. I'll just move my face. There we go. So we can see above normal is the green line. So high precipitation during the months of June, July, and August result in higher yields. What about temperature? Well, temperature has increased in the months of April and May during this time period. And how does that affect yield? Well, we can see that high temperatures during the months of June, July, and August actually reduce yield. Whereas canola is a cool season crop, it likes cool temperatures in May for the establishment of vegetative tissue, June and July that favor flowering. What about the future? We're fortunate that Climate Change and Environment Canada has come up with a report looking at the next time to 2050 and 2100. And they've looked at temperature and precipitation in their report. They've used two emission scenarios. One is the high emission scenario. This is represented by the red line. The high emission scenario, or what I call the business as usual scenario, or what Greta would call the blah, blah, blah scenario, assumes that we do not do anything to get our emissions under control and that we have continuous production of carbon or release of carbon into our atmosphere. So by 2050, temperatures will be 2.3 degrees C warmer, and by 2100, 6 degrees C warmer. And we really have to start thinking about 2100 now, because from the last climate change meeting, many countries just blew by this 2050 mark, and now they're aiming for 2080, and soon it will be 2100. While we may be able to handle a 2.3 degrees C rise in temperature, we will not be able to handle a 6 degrees C rise in temperature. That's basic Armageddon. The low emission scenario assumes that we get our emissions back under control, back to 2006 levels. And if we see that, we're only going to get a 2 degrees C rise in temperature by 2050, and that continues to 2100. Looking at precipitation, the high emission scenario is 6% increase by 2050, 15% by 2100, and the low emission scenario, 5% by 2050 and 7% by 2100. But most of this precipitation will fall in the winter and in the spring. So what does that do for overall climate change on the prairies? Well, our summers are going to get warmer. Growing seasons will increase for crops, but they'll also increase for weeds and pests and diseases, and we'll have more invasive species. Precipitation will become more variable. We'll get longer periods between precipitation events. The soil moisture deficit will increase across the prairies as temperatures increase and precipitation remains about the same. Well, many of you have seen symptoms like this of heat stress in the field. Aborted white pods, blasted terminal racemes, and blasted flowers. When I started my PhD, I noticed these conditions, and I wanted to know what temperatures cause heat stress. When is a crop most susceptible to heat stress? What are the mechanisms? Does this occur in the field as readily as it does in the growth cabinet? And what can we do about heat stress? I was trying to determine a baseline temperature for canola, so I was growing canola at different temperatures in a growth cabinet. And when the maximum temperature exceeded 27.5 degrees in a growth cabinet, the plants were completely sterile. This was work that I did way back in 1986. You see, I had brown hair in those days. So when is canola susceptible to heat stress? When I started working in Ottawa for Ag Canada, I brought this research with me. And to me, it seemed a simple experiment to grow plants in a cold cabinet and grow them in a hot cabinet. And then I alternated plants. I transferred from the hot to the cold and the cold to the hot at different growth stages. I grew those plants to maturity in those cabinets. And I found that heat stress begins as early as bolting and lasts all the way till the end of flowering. Heat stress generally results in fewer fertile pods per raceme, as demonstrated by the plant on the left, and fewer seeds per pod that are fertile. What are the mechanisms of heat stress? Again, a simple experiment was grow plants in a hot chamber, grow plants in a cold chamber, and then cross-fertilize. Take pollen from a cold, put it on a hot, pollen from a hot, put it on a stigma from the cold. And so this is what I did, and that's represented by this diagram here. So we have the male pollen and the female stigma, and the most success occurred when we took a cold pollen and put it on a cold stigma. It produced 16 seeds per pod on average. Hot pollen on cold stigma was also successful, but there were fewer number of seeds. And the worst case scenario was when we took hot pollen and we put it on hot stigma. And this resulted in fewer successful crosses and far fewer number of seeds per pod on average. So let's look at what's happening during Brassica pollination. This is a diagram of the style, stigma, and ovary, or the female part of a canola plant. So here's the stigma surface. On the stigma surface, there are protein and lipid recognition bodies that recognize the pollen grain that lands on it as either friend or foe. In this way, brassica is not fertilized by, let's say, dandelion pollen or another weed pollen. So let's look at scenario A, which is successful pollination. The pollen grain lands on the stigma surface, either carried by an insect or blown by wind. The stigma recognizes it as friend. It's hydrated. And as the pollen tube grows down the style to fertilize the ovary, it's actually given nutrition and guided down by the style itself. So this is successful pollination. Then we have B, partial pollination. And in this case, the stigma does recognize the pollen grain as friend. It hydrates the pollen grain, and the pollen tube grows down and fertilizes the seeds. But the pollen really has low vitality. It's somehow damaged, perhaps from heat stress, and not a lot of pollen gets to these seeds. And finally, we have the worst case scenario. This is what I call a communication breakdown. In this case, the stigma recognizes the pollen as foe. It's not hydrated. And you can actually see this when you put pollen on the stigma surface, you come back and the pollen has fallen off because the stigma has not hydrated it. There is no hydration, the pollen tube is not nourished as it goes down through the style, and there's no fertilization. So heat stress changes these recognition proteins on the surface of the stigma or the surface of the pollen grain, and this results in a breakdown in communication. Can we do anything about this? So the first thing I thought to do was to say, is this ubiquitous amongst all varieties of canola? So I got 50 different varieties of canola. I grew them in a growth cabinet at 2015 temperature, nice temperature. When they bolted, I transferred them to a hot cabinet and I let them stay there for 2 weeks, then transferred them back to a cold cabinet to resume their life cycle. And what I found was that of the 50 varieties that we tested, 15 had greater raceme fertility and produced more seeds per pod than the Czech Westar. 21 had similar raceme fertility and seed production as Westar, and 14 had worse raceme fertility than Westar. So basically, we have a distribution, a bimodal distribution, and plant breeders can use that to select the types that have improved heat stress tolerance during bolting to flowering. What we did find was that new hybrid canola varieties were more heat stress tolerant than the older open pollinated types. How about the field? You know, it's great doing this work in a growth cabinet, but does it apply to the field? So we did a 3-year field experiment in Ottawa, where, because it's a hot place, where we had 3 different seeding dates. And this resulted in 3 different temperature regimes during flowering. We irrigated these plants so that moisture really had nothing to do with the heat stress that we found. We went out in the field at flowering. We counted the number of flowers on a raceme. We tagged those racemes. We went back, harvested them, and we looked at the plots for yield. And what we found was very interesting. We developed what we call the heat stress unit concept. And if you're familiar with a growing degree day concept, growing degree day takes the average daily temperature and they subtract a baseline temperature. And this baseline temperature assumes that the plant does not start growing until it receives this amount of temperature. So we did this sort of the same thing with the heat stress unit. What we did was we took maximum daily temperature and we subtracted a temperature where heat stress began. And we could sum that over the flowering period or over the sensitive period. For example, if the maximum daily temperature was 34 degrees, and we determined that the heat stress temperature in the field was 29.5 degrees, then you had 5.5 heat stress units per day. Those could be summed over the flowering period. And what we found was that as heat stress increased, yield decreased on a linear fashion. Yield decreases by about 4% per heat stress unit. And this was the same for Napus, and Gensea, and Brassica rapa. Nate wanted to know, is there heat stress occurring in the prairies? So he took all of these sites over a 30-year period, and he took the average number of heat stress days during June and July. And what he found was that all locations in the prairies experience heat stress during June and July, some much more so than others. For example, Beaver Lodge does not experience as much heat stress as Indian Head or Swift Current, Morden, or Winnipeg. How about yield? Does heat stress have the potential for reducing yield on the prairies? So what he did was he multiplied the heat stress units by 4%. And what he found was astounding. In some cases, like Lethbridge, yield has already been reduced by heat stress by up to 35%. So yield losses go from 5 to 35%. He looked at early and late planting in his simulation, and he found that in some cases, early planting does reduce heat stress somewhat. So in summary, heat stress occurs from the beginning of bolting through to the end of flowering. Temperatures greater than 29.5 degrees in the field result in heat stress. Heat stress is caused by a lack of communication between the stigma and the pollen grain and poor vigor. Cultivars can be screened for heat stress tolerance in a growth cabinet. And in the field, heat stress decreases yield by 4% per heat stress unit received from bolting to the end of flowering. So we can breed for heat stress, and Chad Kozilny and Rob Gordon from University of Manitoba actually did this. This was Chad's PhD thesis, part of it. And now Chad is working for Corteva, so let's hope he's taking some of that information with him, and we will get varieties of canola that have increased heat stress. And we also found that in the model, early planting sometimes reduces heat stress. So this is the point where Nate gets on the hot seat because I'm virtual, and Nate will answer your questions. If you do have other questions, my email address is below, and as well as Nate's at the Canola Council. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference.